Okay, so there's quite a nice link between this and the previous talk in that we're also thinking about inference. So we're trying to work out, in our case, in a temporal setting, what we can gain from the temporal structure of the problem in order to improve search. There's a reasonable amount of background you need to understand for this, so I'll go through it reasonably quickly. So temporal planning, introduced into PDDL in 2003, and we have several important ways in which it differs from conventional planning. Each action has a duration associated with it, which is perhaps the most simple of the constraints to deal with. This is perhaps the most interesting one. Effects can occur both at the start and the end of the action, so that's both effect and conditions. So actions can have preconditions at the start, they can also have conditions at the end, and likewise with effects. And one more thing is we have invariance, so something that needs to hold true across the duration of an action. This doesn't apply so much in non-temporal planning because obviously the actions are instantaneous. And a common way of reasoning with this has been to compress the actions into single strips actions. So when PDDL came along, everybody looked back to the previous work and saw the compression that was used in TGP. So this predates PDDL, and essentially what we can do is we can take a PDDL temporal action and compress it into an instantaneous strips action, where all the effects occur at the end of the action, the preconditions and invariance must hold throughout the action. So why then are we interested in doing temporal planning? We can just compress it into strips planning and reason with it like that. Well, people have observed that temporal planning problems have some features which can't be handled by the TGP semantics. And when the TGP compilation is applied to PDDL, then the result is unsound and incomplete. I'll show you why it's incomplete later. Unsoundness is a bit more complicated to show, but it was proved in our AIJ paper in 2009. And the incompleteness arises because of required concurrency. So if the only way to solve a problem is to have two actions occurring at the same time, then we often can't solve the problem with this compilation. So I'm just going to show you a little toy example of a problem. This is a match domain popularized by Keith Halsey. An engineer is in a dark cellar, and he's got to mend a fuse. In order to mend his fuse, he requires light, which he can provide by lighting a match. So there are two things he can do. He can light a match, and he can mend a fuse. So this is all very well, but you see, we can only solve this problem if we start the light the match action, we then mend the fuse within that action, and then the light match action ends. Because you can see here it adds that there's light at the start and it deletes it at the end. So just some terminology, we refer to this here as an envelope action, in that it must contain the other actions within it. And this is what required concurrency is. There's no way to solve this problem without putting those two actions at the same time. And so what happens if we apply the TGP compilation to this action? We come across some problems. So the preconditions come from here. The match is unused. That's all fine. And the start effects come at the end. But if you look here, we have light from the match and not light from the match. And all these things are happening at the same time. So the start effect is cancelled out by the end effect. And so we have an action, the light the match action, the preconditions that it's unused, and the effect is that it's no longer used. There's no information about light anymore. And you might be thinking, well, matches and cellars, that's a bit of a toy problem. I don't really care about that problem, but temporal planning really is an interesting and important problem. We can use envelopes to model deadlines, so if we have an envelope action that must contain the whole plan, then obviously we've got to finish it within the time that envelope action executes for. And that sort of structure occurs a lot in real-world problems. I've listed them here. So in Mars rover planning we have solar power is only available during the day, it's not available during the night, and communication windows with satellites, hydroelectric power in power distributions, and resource production is a big one. So real-time strategy games, if you've got a resource production action or that increases for a certain length of time and then stops, that all happens within a certain length of time. So truly temporal planning is important for many applications, but most planners use the TGP compression. So this is some previous work we did, and how can we solve these real interesting temporal planning problems? Instead of taking the whole action and compressing it, we split the actions into two separate distinct actions. One for the start of the action, which represents the start effects and start preconditions, and one for the end of the action, which obviously represents the end preconditions and effects. We solved the problem with these separate actions, and then we reasoned about scheduling the plan. And that is precisely what the planner Crikey 3 does. It searches in the same way as FF, but it uses these start and end actions. And we're aiming to find a goal state as before, but we have two extra things now. All actions that have started must have ended, because quite often it would be convenient for us not to apply the end of an action. So the light match action, for example, it would be nice just to apply the start and never have the match burn out, but clearly that's not reasonable, so that's one condition. And the other thing is invariance must be maintained. So each state maintains a list of the active invariants, the invariants of actions that have started but not ended. And we're not allowed to apply any action which invalidates any one of these open invariants. And that's important, and we'll see later why. And then from this classical plan, we also have to check the temporal constraints. So the classical plan induces a schedule. The starts and the end obviously must be separated by the duration of the action. The duration could be fixed, or it could be durational inequality, so it could be the duration has to be between 3 and 5, for example, but that constraint must be met. Adjacent steps must be separated by a small amount, so we have epsilon, which just states that if an action achieves the precondition of another one, it has to come some very tiny amount after that. And we use an STN to check consistency of these, and we keep track of all these constraints. So very quickly, this is pretty standard stuff. Build an STN at every state. Every action in the plan has a node in the STN. Every start action, every end action. And there's a temporal constraint that the maximum duration of A goes from the start to the end of A, and minus the minimum duration of A goes back from the end to the start. That just ensures the duration. If we use Floyd-Walshall on this, we get any negative cycles. Our STN is inconsistent, so we prune the state. We've got an inconsistent plan. And if it's consistent, then we can carry on searching as before.